In just 10 days, cannabis will be legal across the country, but there are still a lot of questions and potential chaos for how this could all unfold, with each province setting its own rules for age limits and sales. But the federal government sets the standard for impaired driving laws and enforcement, as well as product concentration and possession allowance, raising concerns among the provinces and on police forces, not to mention for Canadians trying to navigate the new rules. Joining me now to discuss these issues is Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould. Minister, 10 days from now, marijuana will be legal. One of the biggest questions on people's minds is about driving. How much can they consume and drive? What are the legal rules around that?
Well, in terms of driving, we are taking a precautionary approach. No amount of alcohol or drug consumption, in my view, is a safe amount to drive with. So if you have consumed alcohol or drugs, it is strongly recommended that you not get behind the wheel of your car.
But what's the law on it? Because you can consume alcohol and get behind the wheel as long as you're below a certain percentage point. How is that going to work with marijuana? Is it zero tolerance, or is there an amount that people can have consumed?
Well, I mean, again, I'm going to say that there's no amount that's safe to consume in terms of drugs and getting behind the wheels of your car. We have in the legislation provided law enforcement officers with many tools to be able to detect whether or not somebody is impaired by alcohol or drugs. And for safety's sake, for the sake of the safety on the roads, we recommend that people not get behind the wheels of their car if they've consumed any alcohol or drugs.
I'll try this another way. At what point are you going to be charged with impaired driving?
Well, it depends on a case-by-case basis. So police officers have the opportunity to go through a series of different tests to conduct standard field sobriety tests. We are training drug recognition experts to be able to determine whether or not they are of the view or see probable grounds that somebody has been impaired by drugs. And we also are to build the probable grounds to take a blood sample to determine whether or not the individual has been impaired by drugs. Are
you concerned about the science with that? Because I know it's pretty clear with alcohol. You know, at a certain percentage of alcohol in the bloodstream, somebody is impaired. There's less science with marijuana because it hasn't been legal, so you couldn't really get people high to test it. And there's some concern there could be legal challenges because somebody could have THC showing in their system and not be high, or could have a low level showing but expresses as someone who's very impaired.
Well, that's why we have provided law enforcement officers with a myriad of tools. Driving while impaired has been on the books as an offense for over 100 years. In the legislation, we provide law enforcement officers with a test that enables them to determine by taking a sample of saliva to determine whether or not somebody has drugs in their body, THC. It registers a pass or a fail. That's one tool that we provide law enforcement officers, but in addition to that, law enforcement officers are trained in terms of sobriety testing on the roadside, as well as drug recognition expertise, and all of that are indications that lead to probable grounds that there is a likelihood of drugs in somebody's system, which would lead to a blood sample. There is always going to be, I suspect, legal challenges around impaired driving, but
and that's one of the things I was hoping to talk to you about, because the Drakkar, which is the device you've chosen, reportedly doesn't work very well in cold conditions, and it's pretty cold in much of Canada from maybe October until May. How are you going to deal with that? Are you just going to sort of sit back and wait for this to be challenged in court? Because I'd imagine that's going to happen pretty quickly.
Well, I was pleased to certify the Drakkar as the additional tool that law enforcement will have. That tool, the Drakkar, has been and was recommended by a series of experts that provide recommendations to me, the Drug and Driving Committee of the Canadian Society of Forensic Scientists.
And you're not concerned about that cold factor?
Well, the Drakkar was tested on the roads quite extensively in differential temperatures. I'm confident the Drakkar provides a tool for law enforcement officers, an additional tool for them to take in terms of being able to determine whether or not somebody has been impaired by drugs.
The next topic I'd like to tackle with you is plants being grown at home. You're allowing the provinces to determine this, and some provinces like Quebec are saying they're not going to allow it. Why set the rules on so many things like the content in the product and who can distribute it, but not set the rules on something like plants federally?
Well, there's a number of, as you know, in the legislation, that a number of provisions that are permissive to provinces and territories around age and also around the number of plants that can be grown at home. And provinces have taken it upon themselves to determine what the appropriate number of plants they want to grow. In the legislation, we speak about 4. We considered home grow quite extensively. We benefited from recommendations from our task force that we took, and recommendations from across the board in terms of our legislation. So this is coming from us based on extensive review by the task force, extensive consultations that we did across the country, and we want to ensure that we provide the opportunity for home grow and that it is going to be further regulated by provinces.
Do you think it's a little bit Harper-esque, though, that this is what they used to do? The Conservatives would pass legislation and say, we're going to let someone challenge it in court. That's kind of what your government is doing on a lot of this file, too. We'll pass the legislation, then we'll see what the courts decide.
No, we believe, and we have been working very cooperatively with the provinces and territories, recognizing that provinces and territories are different, and we have, through the legislation, as I said, provided some permissive provisions that enable provinces, reflective of their own individual citizens, to make some changes and adapt to the circumstances in the provinces. And the amount of plants, or the number of plants that individuals can grow, can be changed and determined by provinces. But we are going to continue to work with the provinces to ensure that this is a seamless, in 10 days from now, legalization and a strict regulatory regime.
What are you advising Canadians to say at the border when they cross if they're asked whether or not they've consumed marijuana?
Well, as I've always said, and I know that my colleague, the Minister of Public Safety, has always said, that when you are approaching a border and you're going into the United States or other places, that to tell the truth and to answer questions truthfully.
And finally, I just want to ask you, when it comes to where people can smoke cannabis, there's been some questions about why smoking instead of edibles, for starters, because there's more overdoses with edibles, and your government thinks that smoking is unhealthy, and also that you can do this out in public, which people are complaining about. Why did you choose to deal with only the smoking first?
Well, there's more extensive work that the Minister of Health and the Minister of Border Security are doing around ensuring the proper regulation around edibles. But in terms of where one can smoke in public, again, we're working very cooperatively with the provinces and territories. They're working with local municipalities to make determinations around that based on what they're hearing and what their priorities are and what laws and regulations they have in place.
Will there be any kind of a public health campaign to advise people of what amounts of marijuana could result in intoxication? Because with alcohol, most people have a sense of what a beer or a glass of wine will do, but there's not that experience necessarily with marijuana.
Well, we are launching or continuing a public education campaign. Many people will have received or will receive soon information in their mailboxes right across the country about legalization and the strict regulation with warnings. But we're going to continue to make sure that we have a broad public education and information campaign. But I will say again, as we started the interview, I believe fundamentally that there is no amount of alcohol or drugs that one can consume and get behind the wheel of a car. We need to make sure that we have safe roads out there.
We have to stop it there, Minister, because we're out of time, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much.